It is a spring morning in the Balkans, 447 AD. Low mist hangs over the fields near the Utus River. On a slight rise above the floodplain, officers of the Eastern Roman army observe the northern horizon. Trumpet calls drift across the field. Along the line, infantry adjust their formations, while cavalry units remain in reserve behind the wings. Orders move quietly along the ranks. Across the open ground, movement becomes visible. Columns of mounted troops begin to take shape. Attila's army, composed of Huns and allied contingents, Ostrogoths, Gepids and others, spreads out in a wide front. A screen of mounted archers rides ahead, probing the space between the lines. Behind the main body, pack animals and supply wagons remain out of sight, guarded by auxiliary troops. The Roman position is anchored between the river to the left and wooded high ground to the right. Both sides understand this engagement will be different from earlier raids. The terrain, the preparation, and the scale suggest a pitched battle is imminent. There is little movement now, just final adjustments and brief signals. The armies are in position. The battle is about to begin. In the early 430s, the Huns under the joint leadership of Attila and his brother Bleda began to consolidate their power in the Carpathian Basin, with their mobile headquarters likely centered near the Tisa River in what is now eastern Hungary. The headquarters were a focal point of a militarized system of dependent tribal outposts, semi-permanent encampments, and a mobile logistical apparatus that allowed the Huns to project power in all directions across the Danubian frontier. Their authority encompassed a broad coalition of Germanic and Sarmatian client groups, including Ostrogoths, Gepids, Sciri, and Rugians, who contributed elite cavalry and infantry forces in return for political status, loot, and military protection. Attila's leadership unified these diverse contingents under a common purpose and command, transforming intermittent tribal warfare into a coordinated apparatus of imperial-scale pressure against surrounding empires and kingdoms. The transformation of the Hunnic Confederation from a raiding culture into a quasi-imperial military machine was underway. Under Attila's influence, it became capable of sustained campaigning, siege warfare, and direct negotiation with the Roman state on equal terms. This new force made Roman officials seek a formal diplomatic arrangement that would avoid escalation with the Huns. One such important diplomatic arrangement was the Treaty of Margus, signed in 435 between the Eastern Roman Empire and the Huns at the frontier town of Margus. The treaty guaranteed an annual tribute of 700 pounds of gold to the Huns, required the extradition of Hunnic fugitives from Roman territory, limited trade to specific border posts, most notably Constantia, and established mutual non-aggression terms between the two powers. Though designed to preserve peace, the treaty quickly became a point of friction. Roman religious authorities often sheltered Hunnic defectors, and enforcement of the extradition clause proved politically difficult. At the same time, the Eastern Empire, under Theodosius II, began refortifying the Danube frontier, particularly around the fortified cities of Ratiaria and Viminacium, actions that Attila and Bleda interpreted as treaty violations. In 441, Attila launched his first coordinated invasion of the Balkans. Roman defenses along the Danube collapsed rapidly. Cities such as Viminatium, Margus, and Singidunum fell within weeks, followed by deep raids into the provinces of Moesia and Dacia Ripensis. The invasion devastated regional infrastructure, displaced tens of thousands of civilians, and revealed the fragile state of Roman preparedness. A temporary pause in hostilities allowed the Eastern Empire to redeploy its forces, but this was short-lived. In 443, Attila resumed his campaign in the Balkans with a force that was not only larger but significantly more tactically sophisticated than during his initial assault in 441. While the earlier offensive had relied heavily on speed, mobility, and intimidation, the renewed invasion was characterized by its use of siege warfare, a rarity among steppe powers. According to Priscus and other late antique sources, the Huns had by this time acquired or developed siege equipment capable of breaching Roman fortifications, likely through the coercion or employment of captured Roman engineers, and the technical assistance of Germanic auxiliaries such as the Ostrogoths or Gepids, who had prior experience with Roman fortifications. The shift from fast-moving raids to deliberate siege operations marked a major evolution in Hunnic military doctrine. Attila's forces now employed siege towers, battering rams, mobile palisades, and possibly torsion artillery to take fortified cities once considered secure. These capabilities allowed the Huns to strike not only at frontier forts, but deep into the strategic and symbolic heart of the Balkan provinces. One of the first and most devastating targets was Naissus, a heavily fortified city on the Via Militaris and a critical Roman military and logistical hub. Its position made it a key transit point between Thrace, Moesia, and Dacia Mediterranea, and it was historically important as the birthplace of Constantine the Great. Attila's siege of Naissus was brutal and lengthy. The city resisted, but its walls were eventually breached. Once captured, Naissus was systematically destroyed. Contemporary accounts describe scorched earth tactics, mass slaughter of civilians, and the enslavement or deportation of survivors. The city's infrastructure, forums, baths, granaries, and temples was demolished. Following the sack of Naissus, Attila advanced west and south, laying siege to other major cities. Serdica, another critical node on the Roman road network, was taken with equal violence. As the provincial capital of Dacia Mediterranea, Serdica had previously been used as an imperial residence. Its fall symbolized the collapse of Roman administrative control in the central Balkans. Like Naissus, it was heavily damaged and the garrison either annihilated or enslaved. Further east, Attila's forces captured Philippopolis, the capital of Thracia Secunda. As one of the oldest urban centers in the Balkans, Philippopolis had cultural and strategic value. Its capture not only extended Hunnic reach toward the Rhodope Mountains and Aegean approaches, but also cut the remaining overland links between the imperial capital and its southwestern provinces. The city, like others, was looted and largely depopulated. Its political and military role was functionally erased for the remainder of the campaign. The scale of the devastation in 443 was unlike anything seen in the Balkans since the Gothic invasions of the 3rd century. Entire dioceses were rendered ungovernable. The road system, so vital to Roman military logistics, was compromised by ruined bridges and cities turned into refugee camps. Crop stores and supply depots were pillaged or burned, causing regional famine. It is estimated that over 70 cities fell during this phase of Attila's war in the Balkans. The psychological toll was immense. The civilian population, already strained by economic hardship and plague, began fleeing en masse toward the coastal cities and islands. Refugees overwhelmed Thessalonica, Adrianople, and the Thracian Chersonese. Roman landowners and clergy fled to Constantinople, bringing with them reports of atrocities and pleas for aid. Strategically, the 443 offensive eliminated the Eastern Empire's forward defensive depth. Cities that once served as mustering points, depots, or strongholds were gone. The Danube frontier, which used to be dotted with castra and limitanae garrisons, had ceased to function as a border in any meaningful sense. There was no longer a buffer between the Huns and Constantinople, save for distance. Attila's campaign concluded with the Eastern Empire in a state of total military exhaustion. The field armies had been mauled in failed counter-offensives, and the population base of the Central Balkans had been displaced or destroyed. With no remaining field force capable of resisting him, Attila dictated the terms of a new treaty that not only tripled the annual tribute, but also forced Constantinople to cede control of key economic and territorial zones north of the Hymus Mountains. The 443 campaign served as a tactical victory and a geopolitical reconfiguration of Roman-Hunnic relations. Attila had demonstrated that the Huns were no longer mere raiders, but a superpower capable of siege warfare, urban annihilation, and long-term political coercion. His war machine had dismantled the entire infrastructure of Roman military presence in the Balkans. The devastation forced the Romans into a new peace settlement by late 443 or early 444. This second treaty, imposed by Attila, included an increase in tribute to 2,100 pounds of gold annually, a lump sum payment of £6,000 for arrears, a ransom clause of 12 solidi per Roman prisoner, the withdrawal of Roman forces from a wide demilitarized buffer zone, and the relocation of the trade market from Constantia to Nisus, now under Hunnic control. These terms amounted to a formal recognition of Hunnic supremacy in the Balkans. Though Theodosius II maintained the outward trappings of Roman sovereignty, real control over the Danubian frontier had shifted. The Eastern Court paid heavily to maintain a precarious peace, redirecting gold from internal defense and construction projects to finance the tributary relationship. For the next few years, Attila focused on consolidating power. After the death of his brother Bleda, Attila ruled the Hunnic Empire alone. His position was unmatched, commanding a composite force of cavalry, infantry, and siege engineers drawn from multiple ethnic groups and coordinated through a semi-centralized system of warbands, chieftains, and political hostages. Roman diplomats such as Priscus visited his court during this period and described an environment of court-like protocol, legal arbitration, and controlled brutality. But the peace was short. By 446, the Eastern Empire was again in arrears. A combination of mismanagement, corruption, and internal crisis meant that tribute payments had become irregular or incomplete. Within Constantinople, the imperial treasury was under severe strain. Defense expenditures in the eastern provinces, famine relief, and border garrisons in Syria and Azoria consumed vast resources. In early 447, a massive earthquake struck Constantinople and collapsed a section of the Theodosian walls, including more than 50 towers. The disaster required urgent redirection of funds to reconstruction. The gold meant for Attila was simply not delivered. The Huns interpreted the lapse not as financial duress, but as defiance. He had witnessed the Eastern Empire's consistent pattern: pull back, engage in talks, and offer terms. The Roman state had proven it would rather sacrifice territory and gold than commit to full-scale war. Moreover, the Western Roman Empire was locked in a downward spiral of its own, battling Visigoths in Gaul and facing increasing Vandal aggression in North Africa. No meaningful reinforcements could be expected from the West. Intelligence from Gothic intermediaries and intercepted Roman couriers confirmed what Attila already suspected. The Danubian limes were dangerously undermanned, and the cities of the central Balkans had not been fully rebuilt. There would be no coordinated resistance. With imperial defenses still thin and the Balkans barely patched back together, he saw a new opportunity to break Roman resistance outright. The memory of past victories, combined with the Eastern Empire's visible vulnerability, made the decision clear. Attila mobilized. Roman intelligence failed to grasp the scale of the Hunnic preparations in time. Reports of massing cavalry, warband assemblies, and logistical movements across the Tisa and Danube basins were slow to reach Constantinople, and when they did, internal factionalism within the court stopped any rapid response. For the Huns, the frontier was open, the tribute had stopped, and the empire's strategic focus lay elsewhere. It was the perfect storm for a renewed campaign. Attila had refined his army into a hybrid force, one that fused the mobility and missile power of the steppe with the heavier arms and tactical experience of subject Germanic and Alanic contingents. By early 447, Attila had drawn together an army that likely numbered between 30,000 and 50,000 warriors, an unprecedented concentration of steppe power directed toward the Eastern Empire. Theodosius II and his war council decided to assemble 3 field armies, each built around core professional units supplemented by regional militia and cavalry, drawn from Armenian and Isaurian auxiliaries. Arnagisclus, a seasoned commander with battlefield experience against both Persians and Goths, was tasked with leading the central field force. Originally of Thracian or Illyrian origin, he had risen through the ranks of the Eastern Roman army due to his reliability, tactical flexibility, and political loyalty to the Theodosian regime. He had been entrusted with coordinating regional responses to earlier Hunnic incursions and had a reputation for integrating irregular auxiliaries into cohesive Roman formations. His familiarity with Balkan geography and tribal diplomacy made him one of the few generals capable of improvising against the fluid tactics of the Huns. His army was estimated to be around 12,000 to 25,000 men and composed of Eastern comitatenses, archers, cataphractarii, and a modest complement of heavy cavalry. His army was ordered to intercept Attila as the Huns crossed the Danube and pushed inland along the traditional invasion routes of Moesia and Thrace. The terrain of the lower Danube was well known to both sides. The river itself acted as a natural barrier, but its fords and bridges were few and difficult to defend without permanent garrisons. Roman border forces, the Limitanae, had been heavily degraded over the previous decade. This meant that Arnagisclus's force would have to fight without reliable supply lines or fortified fallback positions. By the time Attila's army crossed into Roman territory, it did so with terrifying speed. Entire regions were bypassed or overrun without resistance. The raiding columns avoided set-piece engagements while targeting towns, trade hubs, and logistical nodes. Settlements like Ratiaria and Oiscus in western Moesia were hit swiftly, their granaries emptied, and storehouses set ablaze. The civilian populations either fled or were enslaved. Then down the Via Militaris, the main Roman military road through Moesia and Dacia Ripensis into the Balkan interior, where the roads were clogged with refugees, their movements further disrupting Roman logistics. In Thrace, towns such as Marcianopolis and Philippopolis were looted systematically, their garrisons too weak or scattered to resist. Even when resistance was met, the Huns avoided prolonged siege and instead used overwhelming firepower and psychological terror, burning estates within sight of neighboring towns, mutilating captives, and leaving survivors to spread the fear. These raids were not chaotic plundering, but components of a strategy to destabilize the frontier, choke off Roman supply lines, and sap morale before the decisive confrontation. Refugees streamed southward toward Constantinople. Eventually, the Huns approached the Utus River, a tributary of the Danube in what is now northern Bulgaria, from the northwest, moving across central Bulgaria toward the area around Oescus Nicopolis ad Istra. The course of the confrontation at the Utus River and its immediate aftermath remains largely veiled in uncertainty. Only a handful of entries, preserved in sources like Jordania's Romana, the Chronicle of Marcellinus Comes, and the Paschal Chronicle, offer glimpses into the events. As with much of Hunnic activity in the Balkans, the evidence is fragmentary at best, allowing for no definitive reconstruction, only careful interpretation, guided by strategic context and known patterns of warfare. In the field, Arnagisclus maneuvered to block Attila's advance near the River Utus. The location was chosen for its relatively open terrain, suitable for cavalry operations, but also providing opportunities to anchor a defensive line along the riverbanks. Arnagisclus hoped to use the waterway to limit the flanking maneuvers typical of Hunnic tactics. He dispatched forward scouts and fortified a temporary camp, drawing in reinforcements as quickly as the logistical situation allowed. Attila, for his part, did not rush the engagement. He allowed his forces to fan out across the countryside, stripping the region of resources and spreading panic. Attila and his scouts maintained close observation of Roman troop movements, avoiding premature contact until the moment was right. Among his vanguard were contingents of Ostrogoths and Gepids, well versed in Roman military patterns. The Huns organized their main force into flexible wedges and columns, a formation well suited for the broken terrain and open plains of the lower Danube. Their wedge-shaped vanguard allowed for maximum mobility and penetration, enabling horse archers to fire while advancing or retreating in fluid, almost circular motions. These missile troops remained unencumbered by rigid formations, constantly shifting positions to probe weaknesses and disrupt cohesion in the Roman ranks. Behind them, Attila's more heavily armed allied contingents, notably Ostrogothic and Gepid infantry, formed a denser, more stable second line, prepared to engage in close combat once enemy formations had been softened by arrow fire. These shock troops carried long spathai, oval shields, and some were clad in mail or lamellar armor. The combination of mobility, missile saturation, and solid melee contingents allowed the Hunnic force to function as a dynamic and multi-layered strike force, capable of both encircling and breaking through traditional Roman battle lines. In addition to conventional preparations, Attila likely employed psychological warfare. Local Roman settlements were torched within sight of Arnagisclus's position. Captives were paraded and mutilated. Hunnic horsemen conducted mock charges near Roman outposts. All of this was designed to wear down morale and create hesitation in command decisions. Roman forces relied on a hybrid system that reflected the cumulative adaptations of 3 centuries of frontier conflict. Their central line was built around disciplined, heavy infantry, primarily comitatenses, equipped with large oval shields, reinforced helmets, and spatai. These troops formed the backbone of the formation, trained to hold their ground in tight ranks and deliver pila volleys in unison before engaging in close combat. Interspersed among them were detachments of Sagittarii, the archers, and light infantry drawn from provincial forces, who provided ranged harassment and supported flank cohesion. Forward of the infantry line, small groups of skirmishers and scouts, often Armenian or Illyrian auxiliaries, screened for movement and absorbed the opening strikes of enemy missile cavalry. On the wings, cavalry forces included both lighter units for maneuver and heavier cataphractarii, whose mailed riders and barded horses were held in reserve for countercharges or flank exploitation. The Roman army functioned like a segmented machine, rigid in its core, elastic at its edges. While this formation had proved effective in prior battles against Germanic tribes and Persian cavalry, it remained vulnerable to continuous missile fire from highly mobile enemies and was susceptible to being outmaneuvered by superior cavalry forces operating in open terrain. Despite the chaos, Arnegisclus maintained cohesion. He issued marching orders, rotated his cavalry screens, and placed his best infantry in reserve to counter any breakthrough. Communication lines were maintained using mounted couriers and signal flags. The two forces were now in striking distance. The Roman army had established its position on the southern bank of the river, just beyond a meandering bend where the current slowed. Their formation followed the shape of the terrain. The left flank anchored on the river's muddy edge, shielded from wide cavalry swings, and the right flank pressed against the base of a wooded escarpment, a natural bulwark against encirclement. Across the plain to the north, the Huns approached in loose formation. A vanguard of mounted archers spread wide in a shallow crescent, already advancing in scattered clusters. Behind them, heavy cavalry units, Gepid and Ostrogothic riders in overlapping formations, held the flanks, while the center remained fluid. Further to the rear, on a low rise veiled by brush and earthworks, stood Attila's command group, surrounded by guards and watching silently as the enemy line solidified. A dense screen of mounted archers advanced ahead of the main body, arrows already nocked in anticipation. The initial contact came with a thrum of bowstrings. Hunnic archers surged forward at the trot, unleashing a curtain of missiles aimed at the Roman front lines. Roman Sagittarii and Ballistarii responded from protected positions behind the infantry line. Arnegisclus had embedded these units at calculated intervals to maximize counter-volley efficiency. Their return fire was hindered by the mobility and unpredictability of the Hunnic horsemen, who fired while wheeling, retreating, and suddenly accelerating. The first serious pressure came on the Roman left. As the main Hunnic line continued to test the Roman center with scattered missile fire, a dense column of light cavalry broke off from Attila's forward crescent. Riding hard along the river's edge, they located a shallow ford, its banks churned to silt by weeks of rain and the passage of livestock, and began to cross in staggered waves. Their aim was to hook around the Roman flank, bypass the infantry's shield arc, and strike at the rear or center from an exposed angle. A flanking movement, classic in steppe warfare, executed under the cover of terrain and momentum. Arnegisclus caught the maneuver early. From behind the Roman line, a reserve detachment of cataphracts, heavily armored cavalry drawn from Thracian or Illyrian stock, was brought forward at speed. Each man and horse was clad in metal plate or scale, the riders wielding long contos lances balanced under the arm for forward thrust. The two forces collided just beyond the river's edge. The sound was immediate and overwhelming. Hooves struck wet ground, flinging mud high into the air. Lances shattered on contact. The Hunnic light horse, built for mobility and harassment, were forced into a rare stationary melee, their shorter spears and lack of body armor leaving them vulnerable. Some turned to fire from horseback, losing arrows at close range. Others tried to peel away and regroup, but the weight of the Roman cataphracts drove deep into the incursion, halting the advance before it could fully wrap the flank. Around them, the riverside terrain became a churned and blood-slick killing ground, narrow, wet, and crowded. Riderless horses bolted along the bank. Shieldless men grappled in knee-deep mud. In the chaos, coordination began to break down. Roman trumpeters issued correctional calls, pulling their cavalry back into tighter formation before the Huns could regroup and counter. The threat was contained, for now, but the attack had revealed something deeper. The Huns were not probing idly. They were mapping the Roman line, testing its response speed, and pressing specifically where the terrain made defense difficult. The battle was entering its next phase. While the left flank held, the Hunnic center began its push. Attila unleashed his allied heavy cavalry in staggered waves, pressing against the Roman infantry with increasing weight. The Roman line held firm at first, Pila raining down as the enemy closed, but the sheer volume of pressure and the fragmentation caused by intermittent arrow fire began to tell. Individual cohorts bent inward under strain, prompting Arnegisclus to order the commitment of his central reserve. In the confusion of the center, a key moment unfolded. Attila's personal guard, a unit of hardened veterans known for fighting, dismounted when terrain demanded, advanced on foot under the cover of missile fire. Using large oval shields and short curved swords, they punched into a weak point where a Roman unit had overextended during pursuit. The breakthrough was narrow, but it threatened to unhinge the Roman line. Arnegisclus himself rode to the breach, rallying the troops and personally leading a counterattack with his mounted escort. For a moment, the tide appeared to shift. Roman heavy cavalry from the right swept in a wide arc, slamming into the Hunnic left with disciplined ferocity. Dozens of enemy riders were cut down, and the Hunnic formation began to buckle. Yet Attila had anticipated this. From his central position, he dispatched a reserve of light cavalry to reinforce the failing flank. These troops harassed the Roman cavalry's rear and forced a disengagement. By midday, the battlefield had transformed into a fragmented maze of localized combat. The Roman center had held, but only barely. Their left flank, though stabilized, was weakened. The right, though tactically successful, had lost momentum and risked overextension. Arnegisclus, still in the saddle, issued new orders: consolidate the center, rotate fresh units forward, and hold the high ground at all costs. Attila, for his part, slowed the tempo. His horse archers resumed ranged harassment, seeking to wear down Roman cohesion through attrition. Wherever Roman cavalry attempted to regroup, Hunnic riders would dart forward with missile fire before melting back into the dust. The field was now obscured in haze, with lines of engagement becoming harder to track. Late in the afternoon, Attila made his final play. His right wing, reinforced by Gepid lancers and supported by a unit of armored Alan cavalry, charged the Roman left, which had already suffered from hours of fighting. The riverbank offered little maneuvering room, and the Romans were slowly driven toward the water. Seeing this, Arnegisclus committed his last mobile reserve in a counter-flanking move. They struck the Hunnic right in its exposed rear, causing brief panic. But soon the Hunnic forces were able to counter this attack and chase and slaughter their opponents at the right flank. The Hun horse archers completed their trap, surrounding the exhausted Roman forces. It was roughly at this point that, while trying to restore the morale of his army, an arrow struck Arnegisclus's horse, making him tumble to the ground. Not wasting a moment, he got up and charged into battle. The Roman center, exhausted and bloodied, locked shields and held formation. The field was a chaotic sprawl of individual duels, collapsed standards and broken formations. Command and control on the Roman side began to falter. Arnegisclus led a last-ditch counterattack to restore cohesion to the faltering Roman center. He charged into the melee to shore up a segment of the line that had begun to collapse under Hunnic pressure. The move was brave, but it exposed him to close-range missile fire from Hunnic archers, which turned out to be a fatal move. Arnegisclus was killed either by a javelin or a lance, possibly during hand-to-hand fighting. His fall had an immediate and demoralizing effect. While Roman officers attempted to rally their men, the loss of senior command at such a critical moment disrupted communications and eroded unit discipline. The Roman center, already under extreme pressure from successive Hunnic charges and flanking harassment, began to disintegrate. Some formations held, falling back in good order, while others broke apart under the combined assault of infantry pressing forward. At this point, the Hunnic force was crushing the Eastern Roman army. Before nightfall, the result was clear. The Eastern Roman army had been decisively defeated. Though not entirely annihilated, it was tactically broken, with significant casualties, including the loss of its top general. What was left of the Romans, battered and leaderless, retreated in order. The Huns did not pursue the retreating Romans aggressively, perhaps wary of overextending in unfamiliar terrain or needing to regroup before pushing further. Contemporary sources emphasize the scale of the bloodshed. Jordanes calls it one of the bloodiest battles of the age, and Marcellinus comes later recorded that Roman military capacity in the Balkans was crippled for years afterward. In the weeks following the battle near the Utus, the Hunnic advance continued with little organized resistance. The shattered remnants of the Eastern Roman field army fell back toward fortified settlements, while Attila's columns moved deeper into Thrace. Some towns surrendered immediately, others were simply overrun and left smoldering. With Arnagisclus dead and the frontier garrisons thinned to the point of collapse, there was little the Eastern court could do. In Constantinople, Emperor Theodosius issued public calls for fasting and prayer. Repairs to the city walls, damaged by an earthquake earlier that year, were hastily resumed. Panic reached the capital not as rumor, but in the form of wounded refugees and exhausted officers reporting that no army remained between the Huns and the Aegean. And yet, Attila did not press further. He paused. Facing logistical limits, disease, and the lack of a decisive siege strategy, Attila halted his campaign. He withdrew north across the Danube, having secured a new, even more burdensome tribute arrangement from the Eastern Roman Empire. This effectively marked the end of the 447 Balkan campaign, though sporadic raiding and border violence would continue. The Eastern Roman army, meanwhile, began a period of slow recovery and reform. Recruitment intensified, particularly in the eastern provinces and among allied peoples. But the military credibility of the Eastern court had been severely damaged. The next major set-piece battle involving Attila would come 4 years later in the west, at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in 451, against a Roman Visigothic coalition under Hydatius. Until then, Attila would consolidate his power, absorb new Germanic allies, and shift his attention toward the Western Empire. Thank you for watching this video. Please leave a like. It really helps out the channel. If there is a topic, battle, or person you would like to know more about, let me know your thoughts in a comment. I would also like to thank all my patrons and channel members for their generous support. If you enjoy House of History and you want to support my work, consider joining me on Patreon. For just $1 per month, you will gain early access to all my videos without any in-video advertisements. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.